I want to welcome all of you. I saw many of you in the synagogue the other night. We had our two services. It was really incredible just to be together again. What an amazing experience of community again. And we've realized the value of online community and realized what's lacking is presence. And we realize we have to kind of be there for each other in a different way. And I'm hoping that as we emerge from the pandemic and emerge from all that we've been dealing with, all of us can see reason to go through the discomfort, and it is discomfort, that it takes to be there for one another and to be in person. So we know that in June, July, and August, we're going to have services in the park. So hopefully that's open-aired and comforting and comfortable for all of you, and that we'll see you soon. So this is our, I believe, fifth in the series of rabbis speaking in residence at VOS Valley Outreach Synagogue and Center for Jewish Life. Tonight's rabbi is wonderful. I think we have a lot to learn from my colleague, Rabbi Sharon Brous of IKAR, founding rabbi of IKAR. I want to, as always, thank Wendy Levinson for being the brain behind the series. You came up with the idea, and more than that, Wendy, you've not only just come up with an idea, but you've implemented it and brought it to fruition. So thank you very much. And I want to thank people who have sponsored this series very, very much for your generosity. It's a great mitzvah and a great thing to sponsor learning, particularly the learning that we'll get tonight. So let me spotlight you, Wendy, and invite you to introduce our guest rabbi tonight, Rabbi Sharon Brous. Give me a moment, and here we are.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Lipaz, and welcome everyone. We're so glad that you came tonight, and we're thrilled that you decided to spend your time with us. I would like to introduce you to our rabbi tonight, Rabbi Sharon Brous. She is the senior and founding rabbi of IKAR, a leading edge Jewish community that launched in 2004 to reinvigorate Jewish practice and inspire people of faith to reclaim a moral and prophetic voice. IKAR, one of the fastest growing and most influential Jewish congregations in the country, is credited with sparking a rethinking of religious life in a time of unprecedented dissatisfaction and declining affiliation. Rabbi Brous was named #1 on the Newsweek list of the most influential rabbis in America, and has been recognized by the Forward and the Jerusalem Post as one of the 50 most influential Jews. She was featured on the cover of Time magazine in 2018 based on Norman Rockwell's 4 Freedoms. Rabbi Brous led the nationwide virtual Passover Seder at the White House this past March. In 2013, she blessed President Obama and Vice President Biden at the inaugural National Prayer Service, and returned in 2021 to bless President Biden and Vice President Harris. She spoke at the Women's March in Washington, D.C., and at the opening of the National Memorial for Peace and Justice the following year. Rabbi Brous's 2016 TED Talk, Reclaiming Religion, has been viewed by more than 1.4 million people and was translated into 23 languages. Rabbi Brous is the inaugural cohort of Auburn Seminary's Senior Fellows Program, which unites top faith leaders working on the front lines for justice. She also sits on the faculty of the Shalom Hartman Institute, North America, and Reboot, and serves on the International Council of the New Israel Fund and the National Steering Committee for the Poor People's Campaign. She is a graduate of Columbia University. She was ordained by the Jewish Theological Seminary, and she lives in Los Angeles with her husband and 3 children. Thank you so much, Rabbi Brous, for being here, and welcome.
Thank you, Wendy, and thank you, Rabbi Lipaz. That was such a long bio. I think I need to I need to trim down my bio because we took a third of our time together tonight. But I'm grateful for the introduction, and thank you for inviting me to come and spend some time with you and with your community tonight. I'm so so glad that we'll get to be in conversation, and really just thrilled to know more about what you're doing and how you're building community. We're neighbors almost out in Calabasas, and so hopefully, maybe one day I'll even get to come to one of your Shabbat services somehow over the hill. So tonight, the topic that I want to address with all of you is building the beloved community. And I want to start here well aware of how far these words sound from where many of our hearts are, anguished tonight after nearly 2 weeks of horrible violence in Israel and Gaza. Thankfully, there was a ceasefire announced, I'm sure you saw just a couple of hours ago. And we're exhausted, frankly, by years of polarization and division here in this country, and devastated by pandemic and by the incredible toll that all of this has taken on every single one of us, some in very personal and transformative ways. So my hope for tonight is that we'll spend a little bit of time together and we'll be able to engage in a conversation that will help guide us toward a sense of where we are and what the path might be before us, and what the healing might look like after all that we've just been through. So I want to start this evening with the Montgomery bus boycott. The Montgomery bus boycott, which we learn emerged with the goal not only of desegregating the buses in Montgomery, Alabama, but in the words of Dr. Martin Luther King, really emerged with the goal of creating beloved community. Dr. King's vision was a global vision. It propelled him from the struggle for justice for Black Americans to the broader struggle for racial and economic justice in America, to the even broader struggle for democracy and peace in the world. It manifested, as many of you might remember, in anti-war work that he participated in toward the end of his life. And that actually was a jump that was very hard for many people to understand. He famously gave a sermon at Riverside Church on April 4th, 1967. And there's a new film about Abraham Joshua Heschel that I strongly recommend that you watch if you haven't yet. It recently aired on PBS, and it might actually be a beautiful community event if you want to screen it together and then have a conversation around it. But they talk about this particular speech, which Abraham Joshua Heschel invited Dr. King to give in Riverside Church on April 4th of 1967. And Dr. King said, as he began to publicly speak out about the war in Vietnam, that many people questioned him about the wisdom of his path. And they said to him, "Why are you talking about the war? Why are you distracting people from our struggle? Peace and civil rights don't mix," they said. "Aren't you hurting our cause by distracting people?" And Dr. King said that this really saddened him very greatly because it made him feel that people did not fundamentally understand him or the movement, or the direct path from Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama, which I visited with my community just before the pandemic, actually, where he began fighting Jim Crow, to that church in New York City about a decade later, where he was fighting to end an endless war worlds away. And he talked about how that frustrated him because really the essence of his Torah, the essence of his leadership, was fundamentally bigger than any one struggle. Remember, he said in Letter from a Birmingham Jail that he was cognizant of the interrelatedness of all communities and states. This is where he famously said, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere," because we are all caught in an inescapable network of mutuality. We are tied in a single garment of destiny. And whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. Dr. King's vision was really one in which all people would share in the earth's bounty. He dreamt of a shared recognition that poverty and hunger and racism, all of these things violate the standards of human decency and needed to be eradicated from human society. And what he offered instead was a vision of universal sisterhood, and brotherhood that would be achieved through reconciliation and redemption, one that transforms oppressors into friends and lifts everybody up in a spirit of love and forgiveness. This is really a vision that I want for us to lean into tonight for our few moments together, a vision in which justice triumphs over oppression, courage over fear, peace over war, and most importantly, love triumphs over hatred. That's what he meant by the beloved community. And what he knew and understood is that in order to achieve that grand vision, the vision of a world redeemed, we had to start at home, because it's in struggling on behalf of our own family, our own community, that we learn to empathize with the human family. It's when we love someone that we learn the power of love. It's in seeing someone that we recognize how important it is to be seen. That vision I think of often as the clearest rejection of the false binary of particularism versus universalism, which we talk about a lot in our Jewish community. Instead, it says, because of my rootedness in my own personhood and my connection to my own people, I become connected to the whole human community. What I want to invite us to think about tonight together is, what does a Jewish iteration or Jewish manifestation of the beloved community actually look like? Or to state it a little bit differently, how can we awaken to one another's humanity? To talk about this, we really need to talk about loneliness. So what we know about loneliness is that it is one of the most prevalent and painful human conditions, because it's rooted in a perception of invisibility. It's driven by a sense that we're not understood, that we're not seen, that we're not worried for by anyone. And loneliness, in other words, is therefore not a kind of external reality, but an inner state of being. It's not about being alone, it's about feeling alone. It's this sense of social irrelevance. And it happens to people who are married, and it happens to people who are single. It happens to people who have children and people who don't, people who are employed and people who are unemployed. Loneliness was a pandemic before the pandemic. And yet it's really clear that the past year and a half has really exacerbated this crisis. And you'll see why I want to start here in just a moment. Last year, a research fellow at the American Enterprise Institute named Daniel Cox put out a study that was absolutely astonishing. He set out to determine the strength of America's social networks. And he asked people, with how many people have you discussed important personal matters or concerns in the last 6 months? And here's what they found. This is absolutely astonishing. That nearly 1 in 5 Americans, 17%, reported having absolutely no one that they were close with. So think about what that means. No one to share your fear during the pandemic. No one to share your uncertainty with. No one to commiserate with about the effects of this virus or the impact of the shutdowns. No one to talk to about the elections or the racial justice uprising or the insurrection. No one to think about what it would be like to sit alone at Thanksgiving or at Passover. No one to process what it means to be far apart from family and to feel so vulnerable for ourselves and our loved ones. And what's really striking about these results is that they did the study back in 2013. And at that time, they were shocked to find out that 8% of Americans reported having no one in their social network. That was disturbing at the time. But now, just in that short period in between, there's been nearly a 9-point increase in 7 years. We're trending hard as a nation in the wrong direction. So I want for us to think about what it really means to live in a society in which nearly 20% of the population is truly alone, whether physically or just emotionally or both. So everyone's talking about polarization in our times, about the massive political and economic fissures. And what this data seems to indicate is that at the center of it all, there's a pretty significant spiritual crisis, a crisis of loneliness, a crisis of social isolation. So we know that the divisions that we're experiencing as a society, even as a Jewish community right now, and certainly exacerbated over the course of the last 2 weeks during the growing violence in Israel, are also exacerbated by social isolation. So here's how. The studies that they did showed that there's substantial homogeneity by race and ethnicity and religion. So this isn't going to surprise anyone, probably. White people tend to hang out with white people. Black people tend to hang out with Black people. Jews gravitate toward Jews. Evangelicals spend most of their time with evangelicals. And that's not even all. Right-wing Jews tend to spend time with right-wing Jews. Progressive Jews tend to spend time with progressive Jews. You understand where we're going here? And yet what they found is that people with robust social ties to people outside their immediate racial, ethnic, or religious affinity groups actually have an easier time empathizing with other people. It's much easier to identify with another person or community struggles if you actually have friends in that affinity group, if you talk to people, if you hear people, if you get to know people who come from a group that's not your own group. So now imagine that you're not only not engaging anyone who's not a Jew of your exact political perspective, but you're not really engaging anyone at all. That level of social isolation, that's where 20% of Americans are today. And that has not only a social and an emotional impact, but also a political impact. So what does that loneliness, what do those feelings of isolation and what often comes with them, shame and fear, what does that engender? What does it do to a person? And what about that aloneness, that lack of open-hearted, curious debate, healthy disagreement, or generative descenses, as my colleague Rabbi Melissa Weintraub calls it? What does it do to a person to not be able to engage in that kind of rigorous back and forth that makes life so powerful and so meaningful? The lack of social isolation, it hardens our hearts. It absolutely hardens our hearts. And there's a book that Dr. Vivek Murthy wrote called Together, the Healing Power of Human Connectedness. I think I have it right here. Oh, I must have put it back on the shelf. And he writes about loneliness as a public health crisis. And he talks about it this way. He says, loneliness is the gap between the connections that we need in our lives and the connections that we have. With loneliness comes stigma and shame, which manifests as social withdrawal and irritability and anger. And here's what's important for us to know. According to Dr. Murthy, human beings need 3 dimensions of relationships in our lives. When we're missing even one of these dimensions, we will likely suffer from loneliness. You might be able to guess what some of these are. The first dimension of relationship that we need, he says, is intimate and emotional relationships. There's an innate longing for a confidant. It doesn't mean a lover, it means a friend. It could be an intimate partner, it could be a trusted friend, someone who can really see you, and someone who you can see, someone who you really trust. This is a real human need, he says. The second layer is social relationships. This is a yearning for quality friendships, for social companionship and support through difficult times. This is your friend group. This is the group of people you're most excited to go back and have dinner parties with after everything that we've been through. And third is a collective communal relationships. We, as human beings, we hunger for and we need networks, communities of shared purpose. We need the people with whom we stand on the same side of history. We need the people who we collectively are working together with in order to achieve greater ends. And Murthy says that we need all 3 of these kinds of relationships in order to thrive and in order to not feel lonely. So you might have a deeply fulfilling marriage and a great friend group, but you still feel lonely because you don't have community. And that doesn't mean that something's wrong with your marriage. It just means we have very real human needs for all 3 kinds of our relationships to be healthy. So what does it mean for us today as we're beginning to step out of this incredibly challenging time of isolation on top of isolation, it means that it hasn't been easy to show up for community, even for those who are inclined not to be part of the 20%. It's taken real effort to find our way to each other in the course of this last year and a half. And it takes a great effort now. I know that there's incredible resistance among many people to stepping back into the world, even when we know that it's safe to do so. And yet our health and the health of our society actually relies on us taking those steps. In the Torah, it says that God creates light and says that light is tov, it's good. And God creates the earth and the seas and the grass and the trees and the fruit, and all these things are good. And the sun and the moon and the stars and the birds and the fish and the animals, it's all tov, it's all good. Finally, human beings are created and we're tov ma'od, we're very good. The first thing in the Torah that's lo tov rather than tov, that's not good. Lo tov heyot adam levado, it says. It's not good for a person to be alone. Meaning, before we even wreak havoc on this earth, God is dissatisfied with the prospect of loneliness, which God deems to be a problem of the highest order. And it doesn't only feel bad, it is really bad for us. It's bad for our bodies. It's bad for our communities. It's bad for our physical and cognitive health. In the Torah, the diagnosis, loneliness, comes with the prescription, the treatment. Lo tov heyot adam levado, it says it's not good for a person to be alone. E'aseh lo ezer kenegdo, I will make for Adam a partner. God's response is that first level of relationship that Vivek Murthy is talking about. What's an ezer kenegdo? An ezer is someone who helps you. Kenegdo is by standing opposite to you. Someone who helps you by being willing to oppose you. Someone who's willing to look your way when nobody else looks at you. Someone who can break into your darkest moments, sometimes without even a word, offering presence. Someone who's willing to challenge you and help you become a better version of yourself. Someone who's willing to hold up a mirror to who you are and let you know that you are not alone. Murthy's formula is really rooted in an idea that's central to our Jewish tradition, that we are fundamentally relational beings, that we thrive in community, that we thrive in partnership, that we thrive in relationship, which really brings me to a Mishnah that I want to share with you tonight, which has become for me one of my most important texts. And your rabbi will probably agree with me here, but for every rabbi, there are sort of core texts that become definitional for our rabbinate. And this is one that I keep coming back to, if not on a daily basis, then at least on a weekly basis. I found it many, many years ago when I was actually in rabbinical school and I was looking for something else. And I came across this Mishnah and I read it and I felt it in my body. And I realized that I didn't fully understand it, but that one day I would. And so I photocopied it and then I put it back in the book. So there'd be like a bookmark there so that one day when I was opening the book, that page would fall out and I'd say, oh, this was a little message I left for myself. It was like a signal from an earlier time. This is a 3-line text that is buried deep in our ancient code of law in a chapter that's dedicated to the architectural layout of the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, lately very much in the news. So here's what it says. It says that anyone who's entering the Temple Mount would enter and turn right, and then circle around the courtyard and then exit from the same entrance that you came in, but exit from the left. Okay, so hundreds of thousands of pilgrims would make their way to Jerusalem, go up to the Temple Mount. They would enter in, they would turn right, and they would circle all the way around the courtyard, and then they would leave from the left, except for someone for whom something had happened. Those people, says the Mishnah, they would walk in and they would circle to the left. And every single person who's going from the right, when they pass someone who's walking from the left, would have to stop and say, Malach, what happened to you? Why are you circling this way? And then they would answer saying, because I'm a mourner, because I'm grieving, because I'm hurting, because something awful happened to me. This person who's brokenhearted is told you are not allowed to stay home. You have to show up, but we're not going to pretend that you're like everybody else, because everybody who's ever experienced a loss, whether that loss is a broken heart from a breakup or from a divorce or from a diagnosis or from a death in the family, you know that when you're in spaces with lots and lots of people, it often feels like the whole world is moving one way and you're moving another. You're not allowed to stay home, the tradition says. You show up. But when you show up, the community is not allowed to pretend that they don't see you. They stop and they ask you, Malach, what's going on with you? And you surrounded by people and yet totally alone, have to answer. My mother died. I lost my best friend. Someone I love is in hospice. I had another miscarriage. My kid is really sick. I'm really scared. My heart is broken. Every single one. The community stops and says, Malach, what's happening to you? And those who are in pain answer and they are seen. And then those who are walking from right to left say, may God give you comfort. May you feel the presence of community. May you know today that you're truly not alone. Think about what's happening in this Mishnah. I didn't understand it when I first read it 25 years ago. Now I do. You know why? Because I've buried a lot of people in these years. And I've married a lot of people and I've named a lot of babies, and I've seen love and I've seen loss and I've seen grief and I've experienced my own. And I understand now that what the rabbis were doing was they were building a system of ritual engagement that is based on the most profound psychological insight, which is when we've suffered, when our hearts are broken, when all we want to do is stay at home, we're called to show up and to voice our struggle, and we as community are called to see and offer comfort, because to be awake as a human being is to realize that today you walk from left to right, but tomorrow maybe I will. So I'll hold you today, and tomorrow you'll hold me. That's the most powerful formula that's offered to us from 2,000 years ago. Literally a practice that emerged. The temple's gone, but the Torah remains. To understand the power of that image. Today, I walk from left to right, and you hold me. Tomorrow, I'll walk from right to left, and I'll hold you. So there's another story in the Talmud that this is like. A story of Rabbi Yochanan, who grows. He's a person who's suffered incredible loss, Rabbi Yochanan, and it actually says in the Talmud that he had 10 children who died. I mean, it's like an unthinkable loss. And whenever anyone's sick, Rabbi Yochanan would show up by the friend's side and say, give me your hand. I love that image of Rabbi Yochanan. He's the person who's not afraid to touch someone who's in pain. Some of you have been frontline workers during this time, I'm sure. I can't see your faces, but I know that in your community there have been, like, the people who through this time weren't afraid, or maybe they were afraid but overcame your fear and showed up anyway and reached out your hand and touched and brought food and brought care, even when the whole world was trembling in fear, and just gave love when you could. So Rabbi Yochanan did that too. And he would reach out his hand, ve'okme, it says, and he would lift people up. He would raise each person up. I don't know if he healed them physically or if it was just spiritual. I don't know. But somehow the Talmud says he lifted them up until one day he himself became very, very sick. And Rabbi Hanina comes to visit him and says, give me your hand. And he does. And he lifts Rabbi Yochanan up. So the Talmud asks this question, like, Rabbi Yochanan's a healer. He's got the magic in him. Why does he need Rabbi Hanina? Couldn't he heal himself? And the rabbis explain this. They say, Ein chavush matir atzmo mibeit asurim. A prisoner can't free himself from jail. A prisoner can't free himself from jail. Even those people who are the first to show up for each other, even those who are the first ones to bring the lasagna and stick it in the freezer after there's been a death in the community, even those people need care sometimes, like Rabbi Yochanan. And the story actually goes on that Rabbi Yochanan's back on his feet and he goes to visit the next rabbi, Rabbi Elazar, who's sick, and he brings comfort with his presence again. That's the power of community. That's the gift that we give each other every time we show up. In the temple times, it was built into the structure of the physical space. I know you just did some building yourself. We're in the beginning of thinking and dreaming about building with an amazing architect. And I shared with her this story, and I'm like, I want to think about how when people walk in, we can embody the practice of entering and turning to the right, and those who are in pain entering and turning to the left, and actually encountering each other in a way that is so countercultural in America. In temple times, it was built into the physical space. Today, it's built into our ritual life. It's built into the life of the community. Think about Mourner's Kaddish, which is not just a repetition. It's essentially a screenplay. It's a dialogue between the Avel, the mourner, and the Kahal, the community. The Avel says, Yitkadal v'yikadash shemei rabbah, and the community interrupts and says, Amen. And then the mourner says, and the community again interrupts to say, Amen, 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 Amen. We're in conversation with each other, precisely in the moment in which our hearts are hurting the most. We stand up and say in front of a whole community, I'm hurting, and the whole community responds, Amen. We're here. You're not alone. We can't take your pain away. But we can sit with you. We can weep with you. We can say amen. We're here now and we're not going anywhere. The real power of Mourner's Kaddish, it's not the words themselves, I don't think. It's the dance between the mourner and the community at exactly the moment when nobody really wants to dance. It's the creation of heart space in the void of a loss. It's the admission that as much as I feel isolated and brokenhearted, I am not alone because I have a community. This is the first critical step in building a beloved community. It's the recognition that life, and especially Jewish life, is not lived monologically. You can't even say Kaddish without a minyan. You can't even grieve your own personal loss without showing up and finding 9 other people and saying Yikadav Yikadash Shemei Rabbah. And why is that? Because your couch can't say amen. Your foosball table, forgive me, it's my backdrop here, cannot hold your grief. For that, you need other living beings. That's what I call the amen effect. You need other people to see you and for a moment to say amen, amen, amen. It's, by the way, the reason that I have completely, wholeheartedly embraced Zoom minyanim, which I never would have done before the pandemic. But I understand that it's about the amen. It's about knowing that when you say those words, I'm hurting, others respond saying amen. It's about knowing that when you walk in and turn to the left, someone else who's walking from the right will say, Malach, what's happening for you? This is the plague this is the antidote to the plague of loneliness. This is the way that we break out of the confines of our time of pandemic and division and polarization by actually showing up, by actually seeing each other. I'm gonna close in a moment. I want to tell you a true story that happened at Ikar years ago that really, I think, embodies this idea that I'm trying to put forward today. So it's a Friday night, and you know wholehearted, beautiful, joyous services in your community. You know them. This is what's happening at Ikar. We're in this service. It was like an experimental service that I tried years ago, where I realized that when we sit down in the chair, we get really comfortable and even a little complacent. And so I started pulling all the chairs out of the room and just having people just stand if they could. We had some chairs for people who were not able physically to stand. But I wanted to see what would happen if we just allowed the spirit of the tefillah, of the davening, of the prayer to enter not just our head space, but our body space. And so it took a few tries. The Jews were not happy with me. There were lots of people complaining. It happens whenever you try something new. But by the 3rd time we tried it, people loved it. And it became the best service of, that we would do. Eddie Carr. And so we have this service, and people are dancing and singing and moving, and it's amazing. We're in the middle of this beautiful davening, and someone comes over to tell me that a couple that met Eddie Carr was so deeply moved by the spirit of our services that they actually got engaged right in the middle of L'cha Dodi. It's like, that's like rabbi heaven, right? Am I right, Rabbi? Yeah, that's a dream. So anyway, I was so happy. I was so ecstatic. And I just like burst into tears, and I wanted to tell the whole community. But just before I did, I looked up, and right in the back, in the corner of the room, I noticed this guy who was a beloved community member, but he hadn't been around for a long time. And I know he was in the middle of a terrible divorce. And I know that one of his parents was dying. And I know that he was suffering. And all of a sudden I was stuck, and I thought, like, what am I supposed to do? Because should I tone down the celebration of this couple so I don't inadvertently contribute to the hurt of this brokenhearted person? Or do I celebrate and let the flow of life and death and love and loss just stand really starkly in the middle of our sacred space on this Shabbat, in the middle of this service? What if this guy leaves and he never comes back to shul again, precisely because he's chosen to show up when he needs community the most, and he can't deal with the cognitive dissonance of what's going on? Anyway, I chose to celebrate, and I realized it was a risk, but I just announced, friends, Dan and Rachel just got engaged. And people went crazy, and they're whooping and cheering and dancing, and everyone's singing, and someone runs over with a talit, and they're holding it over Dan and Rachel's head, and we're all dancing. But like, I just am devastated, because I look up at the corner of the room and my guy is gone. He's nowhere to be seen. And I think I must have just sent him away. And I feel so bad. And then a moment passed, and I realized that not only had he not walked out of the room, but he actually had stepped in closer to the center of the room. And a minute later, I swear to you, he was dancing and singing and celebrating. He was holding a corner of the talit, this chuppah, over this couple's head. A couple he did not know, by the way. Anyway, the service ends, and I go over to him and I said, I want to tell you, I was so moved to see you celebrate with this couple that you don't even know, given everything you're going through. And he said to me, are you kidding me? That was so healing for me. They found what we all wish that we had. How could I let them dance alone? I share this with you because I really believe that the way that we break out of the incredibly self-destructive and socially destructive and paralyzing feeling of loneliness is we try to find a way, despite our loneliness, to see someone else, to see their joy, to see their pain, to see their dreams. That's how we break out of our own sense of aloneness. In the words of a rabbi named Rabbeinu Yonah, he says that each one of us is obligated to exert to the full depths of our very soul on behalf of another person. That's one of the most important things that a person can do in your life. We know that our lives are infinitely more meaningful when we toil on behalf of another person, when we share in their joy, when we work to alleviate their suffering. That's the power of community. So what does this have to do with Dr. King and the Montgomery bus boycott and the sense of interconnectedness that he spoke about in the letter from Birmingham jail? When we see one another, when we engage with eyes and hearts that are open to one another, we're led from the apathy and the anguish into a place of love and community. We're led from our powerlessness into strength. And that's about more than building sweet, loving, Hamish communities and making friends. That's actually about building beloved community, a community that's positioned to embrace not only the interrelatedness of all of its members, but of all human beings. A community that's positioned to affirm that we are all caught in an inescapable network of mutuality and tied in a single garment of destiny, that all of our stories matter. That I believe is the greatest response to human suffering. And the best way to achieve social change and to seek out the humanity in each other. There's a story that I shared, Eddie Carr, this past Shabbat, that's told by George Orwell. It's an incredible story about the time that he was enlisted as a soldier in the Spanish Civil War in the 30s. He was positioned, he says, on a strategic perch, and he was ordered to shoot any enemy troops that came within sight. And he crouched for hours and he waited until he finally saw an enemy soldier jump out of the trenches in full view. And he was about to shoot the guy until he noticed that the man was half dressed and he was holding up his pants with both hands as he ran. And suddenly he couldn't shoot him. And he wrote later, "I came here to shoot fascists, but a man who's holding up his trousers isn't a fascist. He's just a visibly fellow creature. And you just don't feel like shooting a visibly fellow creature." I think that's the challenge of our time. Lo tov heyot adam levado. It's not good for us to be alone in the world. And the way that we break out of that is to show up, to walk against the grain, to let someone hold us, to let someone say amen to our Kaddish, to build the sacred foundation of beloved community, to see one another as a visibly fellow creature, to allow ourselves to see the humanity in each other, the joy and the suffering, the grief and the potential. And that, I believe, is the path toward healing our broken hearts. And I hope also toward healing our broken society. So thank you for having me with you tonight.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that wise teaching. I want to just join you on the screen. And I have a lot of thoughts apropos of what you said. I was really moved not only by the wisdom, but also the colors that you added, the stories, the way you brought all of this to life, the Talmud, the Torah, but also by your impassioned delivery, which I know you for as well. I know that these aren't just words from your mind. One of the things that struck me was that, yes, I think everybody's nodding their heads. You see mine nodding throughout your talk, but I think I'm representing everybody who hears you. We're all relating to the invisibility of self right now. And I think we're also relating to, sorry, that's our parent who's hearing me speak. He might chime in. But we're also relating to the anxiety of being, right? The anxiety of being together, the anxiety of being apart. Everybody has a level of this invisible anxiety that maybe is pulling us away from each other as well. I don't know if I can be close to this person. We have the protocols. Can I hug? Can I greet? Can I mask? Can I unmask? So there's a lot that's built in right now that's keeping us apart. One of the things I think about is there's another thing that's keeping us apart. And while you and I are driven toward harmony and unity, or let me say unity, if not harmony, and I'll explain why I say that, I don't mind dissonance. And I don't think you do either. I don't mind dissonance of beliefs and ideas in terms of interreligious dissonance, political dissonance, communal dissonance, as long as we're rooted in values that we share. But one of the things that I see that I hear from people is pulling them away from community, away from synagogues, away from churches, is politics, is a sense that they're wrong, so therefore they won't show up, is a sense that they're deemed to be on the wrong side of issues, so they don't want to be a part of the conversation, or that they feel afraid to speak because they're worried that what they say won't be acceptable to the audience that's hearing it. So I just want to ask you to respond to that, what your thoughts are. How do we get over that?
Well, I think we have lost the art of discourse. Again, I quoted Rabbi Melissa Weintraub talking about generative Descenses. I don't know if you know her work. I think she.
I know her by name. I don't know that I do.
I think she founded Encounter. She was the early executive director of Encounter, which is a truly incredible organization that really brings American Jews to hear and encounter Palestinians and hear their stories and their narratives so that we can understand one another a little bit more. And anyway, she has become an expert over many years in compassionate listening and conflict resolution. And she talks about generative dissensus, that what we should strive for is not consensus, that we should strive for dissensus, but it should be generative dissensus. We should strive for a disagreement that leaves us both feeling enriched. And I think we have really lost that art. And that's especially the case over the course of the last couple of years, where people have been, I mean, I'm sure they've come to you in the same way, but people have come to me in absolute crisis because of the disputes in their own families and the fear of going home for Thanksgiving, going home for Pesach. So this year, you know what I heard over the last year and a half? At least I don't have to go home for Thanksgiving. At least I don't have to sit at that table for Seder, because we've been fighting so much over the course of the last few years. Now, why are we fighting? Because we don't know how to actually see one another's humanity when we disagree with each other about ideas. And we don't know how to get to the ideas that are at the heart of our disagreements. So, for example, I mean, I suspect when I really have strong disagreements with people in my community, in my family, in the world, I try to think about not where do they end up, but where do they start? What's at the heart of their position? And often where we start is where we can find our way back to each other. We meet at the part that's above the surface, which is you hold by this policy and you hold by that. You blame this party and I blame the other party. But where do we start? Because very often at the heart of our politics, if you really go down to the foundation of it, is fear, is a sense of vulnerability, might be a sense of shame, might be a sense of distrust, that we'll be okay. And at the very heart of it, what most of us really want is to be able to feed our kids and keep them safe, is to be able to go for a walk around the block and breathe fresh air and not be yelled at or shouted at or chased at, not to feel like we might be victimized in some way by another. What most people want is actually something very similar. And so I think what we have to do is find a way to get back to what's actually at the heart of a lot of our disputes and disagreements, and then meet each other again on a human level, because then the dissensus that comes will actually be a generative dissensus. We might end up disagreeing, but we'll disagree from a heart place instead of just attacking one another's, political perspectives or votes.
Yeah, there's a book that I read that really moved me. Well, one of them was called Crucial Conversations, and I used the principles of that book a lot in terms of how you frame a conversation with somebody with whom you have emotive differences, right? There's a heat to the conversation. And another thing that I found really interesting and helpful in my work and in general is a book called Love Your Enemies. Have you read that?
Love Your Enemies?
Yeah, Love Your Enemies. So it's taking love your neighbor as yourself and then going to love the stranger and then saying, but what if we could do better than that, which is actually to love the people whom we oppose. Mm-hmm. And I think that's essentially this. And what he says is that at the beginning and the end of our conversations and all of us have core beliefs, and essentially we're asking the same questions of government, of the world, of ourselves. And he says, this is what we're asking. He said, and he puts them in political terms and social terms. He says, these are the questions that all of us come to. We're answering them differently. In other words, we're looking at ways, means. The why is essentially the same in most cases, but the what and the how are different. How do you see that playing out? And I don't mean politically, I'm not even concerned with that right now, but well, let me ask, yes, how do we get to where synagogues are models for this kind of, I can't remember what you said she called it.
Generative dissensus.
All right, so generative dissensus. Yeah. How do we model that, not only in sermonizing, but how do we model it for our communities and in our communities so that we can make an impact on the communities at large?
It's so interesting. I mean, I guess the way to model it is just to live it. Like there are a few people in my community, and maybe you have this too, and maybe some of them are with us tonight, who no matter what I say, I'm going to get a note from them afterwards about what I got wrong, right? Like, Rabbi, let me tell you what you missed. And Rabbi, let me tell you what you're not taking into account. And so anyway, I got one of those letters the other day after I put something out to the community about Israel and Palestine. And, this is absolutely the hardest thing to talk about. And so, I had a little thing that I wrote. Actually, it was in light of what's going on over there, reflecting on what had happened here in LA. At the sushi place that's not far from my house, which I'm sure you heard about.
Right.
And, he was right. Like he said, what you're totally missing is this. And I said, you're totally right. I did miss that. And I'm going to change that moving forward. Like, Thank you. I mean, I think the thing is, can we actually learn from each other, or are we insisting that we're so hard, that we're so smart and we're so right? And it's, there, it doesn't mean that that I'm a moral relativist. It just means that sometimes people see things from a different perch, and can offer a perspective that complicates our narrative. And are we willing to see the world as a complicated place? Because it is.
Isn't that adulthood?
Right, exactly. It's interesting what you just said. This book, Love the Enemy, reminds me of a book that I have right here from a very dear friend of mine named Valerie Kaur, who's a Sikh American civil rights activist and lawyer. And so she wrote a book called See No Stranger, which is excellent. And one of the things that she talks about is that there are no strangers. That in fact that she was taught that a stranger is just a side of you that you have never previously met. And so she writes about about needing to love the opponent, love the one who opposes you, and what does it mean to stretch your humanity, to be able to see the humanity in the other. What do we lose when we see the humanity in each other? So how do synagogues become centers of generative descenses? Because we make them that way, because we say hard things, and we ask people not to leave when they disagree, but to share with us, because maybe they see something that we didn't see before.
Yeah.
And it doesn't always work. And I can tell you, I can think now as I'm speaking about a couple of sermons that I've given, where literally I watched people walk out the door and not come back, because they didn't know that they could stay and disagree with me. And I can also tell you that some of my closest friends are the people who write to me afterwards and say, let me tell you all the ways that you're wrong.
Yeah.
And it's not easy to be in those relationships, but I think it's really essential that we model that, and that we create the space for that.
Yeah, I agree. What do you think when you look at the trends in American Judaism, like the Pew study that's come out now? I was on an AJC webinar this morning analyzing it, and I only caught part of it. But essentially, they were saying that what we expect, the trends are going in the wrong direction for active, involved Judaism. They said something that was picked up in a Times of Israel article this week that said, but the news is good, that this greater number of Jews are saying that they're raising kids who have some Judaism, some relationship to Judaism. My concern about that is I have the same relationship to that as I do to people who have a Jewish ancestor. If it isn't connective, if it doesn't connect to behavior, then I think it's essentially DNA Judaism, right? It's behind us. It's what we were, a heritage, rather than an active part of who we are. How do you think we shift that to draw Jews back into pews, or Jews into standing in shul, or Jews into engaging in these issues?
First of all, I haven't read that study yet, because the whole,
World's been blowing up. Yeah.
exactly. So I haven't read it yet. But I'm familiar with, with some of the points here. And,
Right. The trend lines haven't changed.
yeah. And I think, in some ways, the birth of my community, and I suspect the birth of your community, was also in response to studies like this that have been consistent over the last 30 years, that have shown, disconnection and disaffection and lack of affiliation. And in my case, I can't speak for you. You could certainly speak to this yourself, but in my case, I felt that the best way to respond to those trends is to build the kind of Jewish life that I would really want to be a part of, and then hope that other people would also be inspired by it. So to build a Jewish life that gave people an opportunity to access our own Jewish inheritance, the richness, the beauty, the majesty of Jewish tradition and ritual and liturgy of Shabbat, right? And also that asked something of us, because I think at some point we got kind of caught in this trend line in American Jewish life that, it's like a free pizza trend line. Like, you want to get Jews to show up at Hillel, you got to give them free food.
Right.
And it's not that it's bad to give free food to people at Hillel, but what I realized is that in some ways, what's much more powerful for people is not what you give them, but what you ask of them. And I know the hour is late, and I don't want to keep us late, but I'll just tell you very quickly that I had this realization once years ago when I was walking through Jerusalem. I was studying at Hartman in the summer years ago, and I had this realization that literally it just stopped me in my tracks. I realized that the whole structure for prayer that we say when we offer a blessing is we say Baruch Atah, we say Asher Kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu. You make us holy when you ask something of us. We're thanking God for making us holy by commanding us to do something. We become holy when somebody thinks enough of us to ask something of us. So I thought, what's going on with the pizza Judaism, the free everything, free trips to Israel, free pizzas, free
whiskey club, right?
Right? Like what makes me special is when someone says, I need you, I need your voice. I want you to show up and lead this thing. I want you to help me identify this. I want your perspective. I'm asking something of you. Not what am I giving you, but what am I asking? And we built a whole community around that. I mean, we basically said to our people, you want to be part of Ikar? You can come for free for the rest of your life. But if you want to be part of this, we are making demands of you, because that will bestow a dignity upon you and a sense of real covenantal connection. We're asking you to show up for the community. Like, you show up at Shiva when you're part of this community. You show up whether you know the people or not. We're asking you to show up early and help set up chairs. We're asking you to host things in your home when we're allowed to do such things, right? We're asking you to make this, like, you are being asked to show up for community. We're asking you to show up for our justice priorities. Like, how it's not just talking the talk, it's actually walking, it's showing up and being in book groups and advocating and flying to Sacramento and Birmingham and Montgomery and DC and being a part of the work of social change. We're asking you to make a commitment to your own Jewish learning. Like, it's not just what are we giving you? It's this relationship becomes a relationship when we're not just giving to you, but we're asking something of you and you're giving it to us. So anyway, that's my answer to the Pew study I haven't yet read is, like, how do we deal with people fleeing from organized religion? We make it really, really good. And we ask people to be part of it in a different way, in which their presence there actually matters.
Yeah, I think we have that in common in the principles of our community. And I'd say both. One is make it uniquely accessible, make it speak to the people in their lives, what's going on in their lives in their world, or that's what we try and do. And the other is volunteerism, is step up and build this yourself and build it and rebuild it and rebuild it. And when somebody asked me recently about staff members we could bring in, I said, I don't want people doing that. I want our people to do that, because people feel invested. It's their home when they put the chairs out, essentially. It's very easy to get other people to do that. And then it becomes a hotel experience. We don't make the bed. And I think it's important that we have that kind of connection to it. Well, I'm really, truly grateful to you. It's been a gift for me as your colleague, as a student of yours, and as a leader of this congregation to host you for this talk. It's been really wonderful. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I look forward to seeing you in person again sometime soon.
Let's make sure that happens. Let me spotlight Wendy with us, and Wendy can say a few closing words. Rabbi Brous, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rabbi, for such a moving and meaningful talk. You've given us all so much to think about. We are so grateful to you for sharing your wisdom and insight with us, and it was truly a privilege to have you here with us tonight. We learned so much from you, and we really appreciate the time you spent with us. Thank you. I'd like to invite everyone to join us at our next Rabbi in Residence program. It's on June 17th. We will be having Rabbi Alicia Magal from the Jewish community of Sedona and the Verde Valley in Arizona speak to us on miracles, magic, and mazal, spells, luck, and superstitions in Jewish tradition. Then on July 15th, we have Rabbi Elliot Dorff from the American Jewish University coming to speak to us on contemporary issues in Jewish medical ethics, cloning, stem cell research, biologically engineered foods, and genetic engineering in humans. Be sure to mark your calendars for the third Thursday of the month for our insightful and inspiring talks. You can find us on our website at vosla.org, and please contact me if you'd like to sponsor a rabbi. We look forward to seeing you next month on the 17th, and thank you so much for coming tonight. I wish you all a wonderful evening. Good night.
Thank you, Rabbi Brous, Wendy, thank you, and thank you to everybody for attending. I hope you enjoyed the evening.